Is that incense, Father Anthony?
Yes, it is.
Is this a vape?
This is a vape. I am tapering off my nicotine habits via vape. Yes, again. I didn't want to talk about this because people are like, "Oh, nicotine makes you die." I'm like, "Yeah, I know. It's called an addiction." Okay.
Hey,
that's not what I want to talk about.
I smoke cigars. I smoke pipes. I like tobacco.
That's fine though. The occasional cigar or pipe is different than having dip in your face like 24/7.
Oh, geez, yeah.
Yeah, so a little different. So I seem a little edgy. It's because my levels are off. But I don't. You know what? We've got Larry Chap here. We've got Father Harrison. I don't want to do the normal podcast thing where it's like, oh, how about your life? I want to talk about a question that I've been thinking about constantly ever since we got it via email. And the question is this. If a priest is a vampire, are the sacraments still valid, celebrated by that priest? Now, I love this question because we need fake theology and real theology to figure this out. Because first of all,
should we introduce who we have here?
Yeah, Larry Chap. They're going to learn about him by how he answers this question.
I'm more interested in the vampire than people knowing who I am, so please go on.
This is what we're doing. Okay, so first of all, we're going with kind of classic vampire theology. Original vampire, Dracula, becomes a vampire by making a deal with the devil, obviously. Okay, so the question I have for that particular instance, selling your soul to the devil, this is an act of the will. I feel like it's something similar to full-on possession going on here. If Dracula was a priest and he has sold his soul to the devil, the soul which has the ontological change, does he still have the faculties of his soul if they've been given over to the devil?
Well, you want me to answer that? I would say it's impossible for a human being to give their soul completely over to the devil, I would say. Mm-hmm. I would say that you can open your soul up to demonic possession, but I would say that's a kind of meme, I sold my soul to the devil, now the devil owns me. He might own you in a sense of being possessed, but you haven't lost your ontological character as, a human being made in the image and likeness of God.
But here's the problem. A vampire is not human.
That was going to be my next point, which ex opere operato only kicks in if we're talking about a human being, and a vampire has... correct my improper understanding of the mythologies involved here, but they're not human anymore, right?
Well, that's the question. So are
they still have a soul?
Are they alive? Are they dead? So if they're they're the undead. That's a popular
undead.
Phrase.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if they are just no longer human beings, they're just these shadowy creatures that have a human visage, then obviously can't be a priest anymore. Can't do it anymore.
No. I would say priesthood ends when you die. So
yes. That's priesthood doesn't end when you die.
Well, geez, that's true. That's very true. It can your ontological stamp stays on for all eternity. Absolutely.
So, let's say you're a good priest. You're walking around the streets of London or whatever, or Transylvania. Let's do that. And you get bitten by a vampire, and you die. Now, there's a person that looks like you who is now a vampire, and you're up there in heaven saying, "Wow, this is really awkward for everyone in my parish." So that person who is a vampire is no longer you. You're just up there interceding for the poor souls in your parish who are going to get invalid sacraments. I think that's the answer to that.
Probably. It'd be like that 1950s sci-fi movie, The Pod People, where, it looks like you, but it's really an alien.
Now, I'll say one more thing.
Can a pod person be a priest? I don't know.
Yes, exactly. That's the adjacent question. But I would say this. If vampires were somehow real, I feel like your baptismal dignity would prevent you from turning into a vampire. I think you would just get a bloody neck. I think if you're a good Christian who's receiving the sacraments, you get bit by a vampire, maybe you lose a lot of blood. You might die from that, but I don't think you get turned.
I can agree with that. Let's sign on with that your baptism keeps you from becoming a vampire in the first place.
Yes, absolutely. Another reason to become Catholic.
Yeah. Oh, yes. That might be. Is that the only reason? I would hope there's more. But
there's more. But that's like top 3.
Yeah. Well, certainly.
Oh my God.
Absolutely.
Okay, Harrison,
Absolutely.
you
Now,
want?
you really got that in an email? That's
We
fantastic.
actually
Yes!
did get this in an email. Yes.
Now,
That's-
okay, interesting. Final thing before I hand it over to Harrison, so we can have a real podcast. The email, like when they were asking us this question, said, "Please respond. It is an emergency." Now, that's very worrisome for several reasons. One, I haven't responded until like weeks later in this, podcast. But like, what's the emergency?
Yeah.
Terrifying.
That is terrifying.
Oh, that's hysterical.
Well, welcome to Clerically Speaking. I'm Father Harrison,
I'm Father Anthony.
and we have Larry Chap.
Yep. There you go.
Welcome
I'm here.
back. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Now it's the trio this time. It's not just
Yeah, all three of us this time.
we had to dumb down the podcast and bring Father Anthony on this time.
Yeah.
I think obvious from the beginning topic that we've really come to a new level. Now, whether or not that level is up or down, hard to tell, but definitely a different level.
No, we
I
have,
I like the opening topic because I like things to be a bit cheeky and fun. So that's great. As anybody who reads my blog knows, I can be a real snot. So it's I like to have fun with this stuff too. Yeah. Anyway,
I'm still not sure if apparently vampires still have souls, but it's like, but a vampire, their nature changes, and so I'm still, and also, what is the nature of a soul is another question, obviously.
Right. Also,
there's
Bram
a lot of theology
Stoker was not a good theologian. Like he was Irish. He had some idea of Catholicism. Because interesting, because they get the hero, I forget what his name is, old German guy, to like take care of the vampires, and he's
Van Helsing?
Catholic. Yeah, Van Helsing. Yeah, Dr. Van Helsing.
Van
He's
Helsing.
Catholic. And one of the things he'll do to stop a vampire from going through a door is to take the Eucharist and kind of crush it up and put it in a putty, and then he makes like a barrier around the door with his putty, which is something no Catholic would ever do.
so it's kind of sacrilegious.
It is. So he has only has a Catholic magic idea of the church. He feels like the Catholic Church is the only one who can handle vampires, but that's because we have the most magic out of all the Christian groups. So it's tough to actually do real theology.
Yeah.
it might be sacrilegious, but you've just actually given me some new ideas for things here. So
Yeah.
I've got a bad draft coming through one of my doors. So
So is this what you do when you have when there's a lot of bad things going on in a parish? Do you just do this around your parish, maybe?
Yeah.
And,
You could also just do like regular holy water or exercise salt. I think that would probably do the trick.
my wife Carrie is a big fan of blessed salt. Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
Cool. So we have Larry Chat back on us to have a nice little chat. He's been wanting to come back on for a while. And we can finally make it happen. And
I've been begging.
begging, yes, begging.
It's been embarrassing.
It's been embarrassing. Life's been crazy on my end, literally crazy, But this too shall pass. So we're happy to have him on. It's good because it means I can shut up more, which is hard to do sometimes. But no, it'll be good. It's going to be good. I had something to say there, and I just totally forgot. But yeah, So Larry, what have you been up to lately? Like, you're still making the rounds on the podcast. You still got the blog going.
Yes, I'm still blogging regularly. I'm doing a lot of podcasts. I've just upgraded my microphone and stuff. I'm going to start making some videos of my own. I'm finally contracting with some guy who, is like a webmaster who's going to run my whole page for me and upgrade the platform because I'm a complete Luddite technologically, and anything that requires more than one or two steps, I say to heck with it, and I'm done. So yeah, blogging, podcasting, but also, I'm working on two books, one for Word on Fire on the Universal Cult to Holiness, and one for Ignatius Press on what it's called The Credo of a Catholic Worker, Our Moment of Christian Witness. And so I don't advise working on two books at the same time and trying to blog and podcast and all that. So I'm busy, but I still find time for my nightly bourbon.
And running a farm at the same time.
Oh, and running our farm, although it's kind of downtime now.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, no, I was at one point writing 3 books at once and doing my doctorate and running a parish.
Yeah,
it's crazy. It is crazy. No, I'm not. I have one little book. I got a little bit left to finish on my Vatican II book, and then it's no more book writing until PhD is done.
At one point in time, I was listening to an audiobook about aliens as well as playing several different video game campaigns at the same time.
Tough,
and
man.
whoo, boy, that was
tough.
exhausting to get all that stuff done.
Difficult.
So I understand where you guys are at. I empathize deeply.
Well, you'd be happy to know that I do have an interest in ETs and the whole UAP thing. So a good friend of mine is really latched into that, really zoned into it professionally. So
UAP thing?
interesting.
What's UAP thing? I don't know.
unidentified aerial phenomena. Get with the lingo, man.
it's
That's
new
the new
lingo.
thing. UFO is so
Just like
1960s.
Just like
Yeah, I mean
OCIA?
the Pentagon refers to them as UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena. That's the new lingo.
Interesting. Huh, interesting. Cool. So, I have nothing to say about that. I don't know. Yeah.
Well, I'm just responding, Father
Yep.
Anthony, bringing up the book on.
because part of me wants to totally sidetrack this thing. I
ahead.
don't think aliens exist. I'm totally anti-alien. I
Wait. Do you mean aliens don't exist in the sense that they're not visiting here, or they just don't exist at all anywhere?
both. So I make an allowance for space fish, space dogs, maybe even space cats, but no space people. I just don't think
No rational creatures.
no rational creatures outside the ones that we know of.
Have you ever read the book Rare Earth?
I have not.
It's written by a scientist, a cosmologist who sort of makes that claim. He says, if there is other intelligent life out there, it must be very, very, very rare. And then he gives a lot of reasons for thinking that, and that the mythology that's crept in now that intelligent life must be ubiquitous throughout the entire universe is just that. It's just a mythology. Well, our radio telescopes hear nothing but silence. We see no megastructures out there in the cosmos that would indicate a species a billion years ahead of us have built Dyson spheres around suns and things like that. There just doesn't seem to be any strong evidence that there's a lot of intelligent life out there. So I think actually it's a respectable position to hold that God has created an entire universe. I mean, a salmon lays 10 billion eggs so that 3 can survive. So the divine profligacy with regard to the expanse of the universe means nothing in terms of our perhaps solitary nature.
Yeah, that's where I'm at with that. Like, why is the universe so big? Because it's fun to have a giant universe. Like, that
A big
doesn't mean
playground.
anything to.
It's just a really big playground.
It's just
Yeah.
a really, and also like this is going a little bit of nerdiness back to the Fermi paradox. That if there are aliens, yeah, like I mentioned, where are they? We should have noticed them by now, given the time and space of that sort of thing. And also, I think just creatively, it makes for a messier story. Like I think the story that we have now of creation, of redemption, it just works so well and is so perfect by itself. Having space people makes the story more into like a bad fan fiction, in my opinion. So just on a literary, cosmological scale, I'm not into it. I'm not into it. And people disagree with me on that part. but
Well,
that's
it
kind of where
could
I'm
be
at.
that the incarnation of Christ is the regional iteration of a cosmic phenomenon. In other words, if there are other intelligent beings out there, God may have incarnated himself within them as well.
Ooh.
So, I mean, that's completely speculative on my
Right.
part. I don't. It might even be
How do you
abject,
reconcile
abject
possibility?
heresy. Might be abject heresy. But I don't see. But anyway, I would be open to the idea that there's millions of other intelligent beings out there, and I'm open to the idea that there are no others. I think that either way works into God's plan just fine. But I agree with you. The Christian narrative makes it's a lot easier to negotiate if we are alone.
And like I'm happy to be proven wrong. If I die and find out that there's space saints in heaven, cool. That's fine. I'm not mad about that. But I'm just right about this. So all you people who think aliens are real, you're wrong. I'm sorry.
There you go. Anyway, that's a great way to start the show.
Vampires.
Vampires,
and
aliens,
baby.
ETs.
All
But you
things
know
I
what?
never think about.
We didn't plan this in advance, but actually it is a question that interests me because we do live in a day and age where Catholics and other Christians are very scientifically aware of modern science and what it says. And that mythos is out there about aliens and thousands and millions of alien beings all over the cosmos. And I think in the minds of a lot of people, it does lead to a kind of religious relativism, perhaps a religious indifferentism that, maybe Jesus is just one among trillions or something, and it's an issue I think that theologically is on people's minds, but nobody seems to take that question very seriously.
And I also think it's a distraction, a purposeful one, if not a conscious one, that in order to avoid the big question of our existence, of the big decision whether or not to accept Jesus Christ, you can distract yourself by going at seemingly big questions about either a multiverse or
Yeah.
aliens. I feel like it's pushing aside, it's a way to occupy our desire for something more and something beyond, but it's a distraction, I think, psychologically, which is another reason why I don't care for it.
It's a
Don't get me-
distraction,
yeah.
but it's also I think it speaks to like the cosmological shift we've gone through of this notion that there are billions of galaxies or whatever, right? Like you feel so
Yeah.
infinitesimally small that in order to have significance, there has to be relation, which means there has to be something else to relate to within this framework. And so these things just naturally occur in that context. You're right. So I don't think we've dealt with that notion. Like, we haven't dealt with the cosmological shift.
No,
sufficiently.
we haven't, and I've actually published. I mean, one of my areas of expertise when I was still in the academic world was the interface between Catholicism and modern science. I wrote a book on it, on science and religion, and the fact is, you're right. There's the late great Italian philosopher Augusto Del Noce once wrote in a great series of essays that the religion of the modern world is actually scientism, the reduction of all true knowledge to what can be empirically verified, proven, or at least somewhat hinted at by the mystique of science. And of course, he laments this fact and says it accounts for a great diminishment in our awareness of what a human person is, who God is, what reality is all about, the meaning of existence, morality. It has deleterious effects across the board. And yet scientism is our religion. And this is what I mean why you talk about that cosmic shift in our consciousness. It is there. And millions of Catholics are affected by this question of how do we deal with the modern cosmology of science. And it's a fascinating question, but there's just so much mythos out there. For example, the multiverse it's almost unprovable.
Yeah.
In theory, it's unprovable because it's unobservable, and yet there it is as speculation. That's completely, but that's an example of what Del Noce would say is scientism. All it takes is one scientist working with artificial intelligence computers to come up with a mathematical paradigm that says multiverses are mathematically possible, and then bang, oh well, multiverses are real. And
it also then brings in, I think, it's a sign of something that Blondel is really big on, of like the immanentism of the infinite. Right, that modernity's notion, the whole thing around modernity is that it immanentizes the infinite, that it brings the notion of infinity down just the realm of the created world. And so there's this like what's brilliant about him is that he's saying actually this is the place to start for apologetics, because this whole push now is a sign of this innate notion that there is something more. But it's still expanding only on a horizontal level. It's not recognizing the vertical, the like not even like vertical is not even the right word almost, right? Like the transcending vertical motion that has to happen in man because of nothing in this universe can satisfy that infinite desire.
Yeah, and there's that is so true, and there's a short circuiting along the way of their logic and their path of reasoning, because you will get some scientists, for example, who are very aware that, say, consciousness is a deep mystery, and it cannot simply be reductively explained through brain chemistry. You know, your brain doesn't excrete thoughts like your liver excretes bile. That's very obvious. So they have all these mystifications like quantum fluctuations in the brain, all this. It's just nothing but mystification. But you will get some scientists who acknowledge, okay, we got to explain consciousness. So they resort to this theory called panpsychism, which is this notion that the universe as such is conscious throughout, a kind of Bersonian idea, the élan vital, and this massive without ever, though, going the next step and asking the question, well, what are you talking about when you say consciousness is latent within the universe? What is consciousness? Why is it latent in the universe? Why not take the next step to say that logos precedes matter, and that there is an infinite transcendence that is the consciousness that they don't want to take that step because it smacks of religion. And so you're right, there is this Blondelian thing going on here. That we.
Yeah, it is funny because we're saying like universal consciousness. I'm like, wow, that sounds like a fancy. That sounds like Logos with extra steps. Like why? But also,
Exactly.
I think part of the problem. I think what the multiverse theory is really all about is it's a counter to the very Catholic theory of the Big Bang. That this
Yeah.
idea that we have some pretty good evidence that there is a beginning of the universe that causes problems. It's much easier to have an atheistic outlook if the universe is eternal, but if it has a beginning, that makes things tricky.
And-
But
and-
if you, so if you have a multiverse, it's a way to make the universe,
And-
or the universe
It's
of
also-
multiverses. Yeah,
It's also a way of explaining the Goldilocks reality of
Yep.
our universe, the anthropic principle, as it's called by scientists, that our universe seems to be fine-tuned for the emergence of life and consciousness, and that all of these very narrow parameters had to pertain, and they didn't necessarily have to. And yet here we are in this universe perfectly designed for the emergence of us. And so the multiverse thing gets you off the hook by saying, well, there's 10 gazillion universes. We just happen to be the one that got it right.
yeah.
It also then starts to remove notions of freedom, because it's like, well, this is just your iteration that you're determined to in this universe, but there's this other universe that exists where this iteration doesn't happen, and 10 trillion of others of them. The other thing that gets really interesting with this, it's a return to paganism in a
Yes.
in
Oh,
a
it
neo-Christian sense, right? So paganism doesn't have the Christianity brings in the whole notion of the true infinite is a Christian notion because of the incarnation, right? And
Yes.
so what becomes interesting about this is the infinite being ripped from the incarnation, and so much of this, but it's bringing about almost these circular notions of time, because the notion of beginning means that there has to be an end. This is something Pieper brings out in his End of Time essay on
Sure.
the notion of history, right? That beginning and end to time in history is a Christian notion. It's a purely Christian notion.
It is a purely Judeo-Christian notion.
Judeo-Christian, yeah.
That there is this, what you just described, and the cyclic sort of models always tend to end up in a kind of regime of futility.
Yep.
And fatalism. But I would also say this: there's an even greater danger in a thoroughgoing immanentism with regard to the spirit, and that is that it blesses everything.
Yep.
In other words, then the spirit is in a sense everything. If everything is a manifestation of the spirit, this immanent spirit, that includes evil as well as good, and thus those categories become meaningless. And then all of a sudden, the basic elemental impulses of our human nature, even the very dark ones, undergo an apotheosis. They undergo an energizing. I mean, it's what the Germans call the cult of Blut und Erde, the cult of blood and soil. That there is a spirit in die deutsche Volk and in the deutsche soil. Okay, and this springs out, and it really does lead to a return of the strong gods, the strong gods of ethnic hatreds, national hatreds, familial hatreds, because all of these hatreds then become elemental expressions of the immanent, just as much as what we would consider the higher virtues. And it was precisely the Christian overcoming of that yin and yang of the immanentist philosophy, or I should say the Judeo-Christian overcoming of that in monotheism, that Ratzinger points out quite clearly is this enormous breakthrough in human consciousness that changed everything.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so my point is that this repaganization of our existence is doubly dangerous and more dangerous than the ancient paganism for a lot of ways that we could.
Because it's a paganism that is Christianity twisted.
Yes. That's the best way. I can't improve upon that. It's a twisted Christianity, just like the Nazi twisted cross.
Yeah, exactly. Amen. Oh, that's a good one.
That's a really good image.
That's a very good image.
And the thing is, like, I was talking about science fiction. I genuinely very much enjoy reading science fiction. I like comic books. I like, as far as like a fun way to make your characters interact in different stories. Multiverse. Okay, fine. I'm down with that. As far as a messy storytelling device to get different versions of Superman to fight. Like, I want to read about communist Superman. That's a fun story to me. But you can see that even if you're not using those ideas in a pernicious sort of way, that I think they are doing some heavy lifting for I don't want to sound dramatic, but for evil. These underlying philosophies that we kind of play with for funsies do inform us and do
absolutely.
form the way that we think. And if we're not aware of them, then it can be dangerous.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I agree.
Man, did not expect to go there. That was fun.
Yeah, that was a great
cool.
conversation.
Cool. All right, so
vampires and aliens. Thank you, Father Anthony.
See?
There we go.
I got boring stuff.
Let's talk about the synod and lame stuff, Father Harrison.
You said you want to talk about synodality because I think it's an important topic because I
want to talk about it. Getting more and more parishioners asking me about this.
Right.
Like, what's the deal? What's going on? So I think it's a good thing to talk about.
And for me, I think it's important to have a good, also a good theological balance about it because it's also not a horrible notion at the same time. It's like the notion of synod has ecclesiological elements. Like it has a strong history in ecclesiology, right? A strong expression of how the church governs her communion. So it's not meant to be this vague thing that does a lot of work and says nothing. Which sometimes I think these terms get thrown around for that. So I think it's just important for people to understand like why. Let's talk about the synod on synodality because in one sense, this isn't all bad, but it can be used for evil. It can be used for bad because of vagueness and stuff like this. What say ye?
Okay, well, first off, in theory, okay, so I would argue very strongly that over the past several hundred years, a distorted pastoral authority has sort of crept into the church. This is the insight of Louis Bouillet in his book in 1982, The Church of God. He says the number one problem that Vatican II wanted to address was the distortion of pastoral authority in the Catholic Church. And what he meant by that was the hyper-centralization of authority and power in Rome, in the Pope. And that is no slight against the Pope, but what he's actually trying to do is to retrieve the papacy in its most proper Petrine ministerial form as, in a sense, the facilitator of unity, in the service of unity, but not this universal jurisdictional authority that controls absolutely everything. And so things like, does every single bishop have to be selected by Rome? Why can't bishops be, in a sense, more synodally elected in local episcopal conferences and with lay people having a stronger voice in who the bishops are going to be? Why all these curial offices in the Vatican controlling absolutely everything that could be handled in a more diffused way, spread out throughout the broader church? Because after all, the church does believe in subsidiarity, even for herself, the notion that decisions are best made at the local level if they can be made at that level. And decisions should only be made at a higher level if it's something a local level cannot do. But what we've had in the past couple hundred years in the Catholic Church is this creeping centralization of everything in Rome, and it has had a distorting effect on the church, where then the bishops simply become sort of vassals of the papacy, and then
which is ironic in so many ways.
Well, yeah,
this is like completely contrary.
And priests become vassals of their bishops, which we could talk about if you felt so inclined.
Very respectful and cooperative vassals who support their local ordinary in every way.
Absolutely.
That's the position of our podcast.
That's right. Yes, and you can disavow the comments of your guest at any time. So that's in theory. So what we're trying to get at here now, especially if we want to have better ecumenical relations with the Eastern churches, who have long had a serious beef about the Roman claims to centralized power, and of course they have their own issues then with disintegration and disunity, but that's a different debate for a different day. But they do prefer a more synodal structure in their ecclesiology. And so making the Catholic Church less centralized in Rome and more synodal has broad ecumenical implications with regard to the Eastern Orthodox. I think it would be a most welcome development from their point of view. And so for all of those reasons, it would be a good idea for Rome to have less centralization. However, the problem is that synodality only works in a church that takes things like holiness seriously. Otherwise, it devolves, in my opinion, into, I can't say this, but a urinating contest. Let's put it that way. Between rival powers. In other words, we just moved power from Rome, conceived of as power in a worldly sense, and we just move it out into these Episcopal conferences. I mean, there was a heresy in the church a few centuries back called Gallicanism, where essentially the French were saying, we don't need no stinking pope, and we'll have the pope as a figurehead, but we'll make all of our own decisions, French decisions for the French, and that is that. We'll pick our own bishops, and you take a hike, Rome. And if we want to change a few doctrines along the way, and that's what the Germans are doing now, like, hey, we want some German Gallicanism here. So, pardon all my bad accents.
The Germans want to become French after all.
Yeah, after all, the French win. After all, the Germans are becoming Gallicans.
We're offending people in the weirdest way on this podcast. I'm for it. I'm all for it.
Absolutely. Germans, French, bad accents, bad German and French accents, vampires, aliens.
They're all very
to heck with them all. But you get my point. My fear is that absent a strong pope at the helm, and I don't think we have a strong pope at the helm. I'll just say that flat out. I'm not an opponent of Pope Francis. I'm not a fan of Pope Francis. I just think he's a very average pope. And I don't think he's a strong hand. And I fear that in simply talking about synodality and all these liberal buzzwords that get tossed around, what people are simply hearing is, oh, goody. Now the Germans can ordain women and the French can ordain gays and so on and so forth. And the Americans can do whatever it is the Americans want to do.
That's a great question. What do they want to do?
Well, they want to bless capitalism. That's what they want to do.
Yes, amen.
The Americans want money.
Wait. Can I pause for a second? Because there's a few things that I've noticed going on in anecdotal way, but on the ground, as far as my perspective. A few things. One, I have seen very much so, not a desire for power, but a fear of power in the church.
That's interesting, yeah.
Yeah, so in this way, when all the COVID stuff first started happening, we would have these big, Zoom meetings of all the priests, and there'd be many pastors who would be begging the bishop to make decisions for them. There was a fear of their own power of making a decision, and some of the questions would be like ridiculous. Like, Bishop, can you please say that these are, and to his credit, a lot of times the bishop refused to do that. It's like, no, you know your parish, you know what needs to happen. You're the pastor, you need to make these decisions. But there's a fear of that. I think there's sometimes a fear of that in the episcopacy as well. Why there's sometimes a desire to hide behind the USCCB instead of standing up in your own authority and your own power as a bishop. There's a fear of consequences that comes with the use of power. So I see some of that going on.
Don't you think a lot of that has to do with the attempt to deflect blame?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, for decisions that are probably going to be deeply uncomfortable and unpopular for a lot of people. So you say, "Hey, don't look at me; it's the bishop's decision." Or a bishop,
right.
"Hey, don't look at me; it's the USCCB." Or the US. "Hey, don't look at me; it's the Pope." So everything gets kicked up the line.
And that's a very human tendency. I remember when I was an associate, I never wanted to stop being an associate because it was great. I don't like this, Father. Oh, go talk to the pastor. Because I can't do anything about it. This isn't my. I'm not. I'm here to help out.
So you have.
This is an interesting.
But here's the thing, though. Is at the same time, we also, what's the notion of power at play here?
Right.
Where's the Christian notion of power at play here, which is vastly different and very countercultural, that hasn't still played out, I think, in our ecclesiology.
Yeah, so I think you see two mistaken notions of power, and we're going to eventually talk about on another episode ordination of the idea of ordination of women priests, which I think is another just form of clericalism or this mistaken idea of power, that there are people who, on one hand, don't want power because they kind of realize, maybe on a selfish level, that power means responsibility, it means sacrifice. Power means the cross for a Catholic. It just does. But the other hand, you will find people, bishops, other ecclesiastics, even lay speakers who have an audience. It can gain a kind of power and use that for their own personal ends. So once again, ignoring the responsibility of power on the other way. So I see those two things going on. But also, I see excitement over the synod based on woundedness in the church. Where, like, I've talked to people, my diocese priests and lay people, who, like, we are in Pittsburgh, and I think this goes for a lot of Catholics in different dioceses as well, we are beaten up. We've been beaten up by COVID. We've been beaten up by going from 200 parishes, well, really, in the 90s, 300 parishes, so we're going down to 60. The lack of priests,
right.
And structures of abuse, not all like sexual abuse, but structures of abuse in the church, throughout seminary and throughout all these things that get passed down in so many ways. And people get worn down and beat up so much, and they see the problem as the actual theological structure of the church. That's the problem, and that's what needs to change. And maybe synodality will change the church so that we stop getting beat up so much. It's a misplaced notion that they think the problem is in how the church is meant to be, instead of the problem is in the sinfulness of human actors. So these are two things that I've seen as far as excitement or fear about the synod.
I think that's all very profoundly insightful, because when I use the word power, when you write a blog, you got to keep it short. So when I used the word power, when I was criticizing the church using Bouillet, what I'm talking about is the kind of power that emulates worldly power, the kind of power that is divorced from service, divorced from the cross, divorced from charity. And that kind of power always, at the end of the day, ends up being kind of coercive, because there's nothing left but coercion. But even more important than that, when I talk, if I said the church in the 5th century started to emulate the power of the empire, that would be true. So when I say that the modern church emulates the power of the world, how do modern, say, liberal democracies exercise power? They do it through the managerial bureaucratic state. They do it through a series of entrenched, anonymous bureaucrats, what people call the deep state or whatever they want to call it. But yeah, these unelected bureaucrats that micromanage everything. And now that we have the surveillance state and surveillance capitalism and the national security state, it just gets worse and worse and worse. But it is this bureaucratization of things that I most fear with regard to synodality, that you're just going to get an endless blizzard of BS from various Episcopal conferences, where they're going to churn out new documents and subcommittees of subcommittees, and this committee and an ad hoc committee and this study and that study, and then they make a CD about it all, and it ends up in the bishop's closet and doesn't move any needles. But if you mean by synodality what you just described, trying to address the fact that this is a deeply, deeply wounded church in the West, that people are existentially scarred in not just by the church, but by what's going on in our crazy world right now. And they are crying out for bread, and they don't want to be given stones. And if synodality means the church attempting to reach down into the grassroots and to truly engage the laity and her priests in this church down in the trenches and allow their concerns to trickle up, then synodality is not only a good thing, it might be the greatest thing the church has seen in centuries. But and I think Pope Francis has good instincts in this regard. Mm-hmm. He talks a lot about the poor and the margin. I just don't think he always is consistent in how he approaches that. And he also seems to hide behind bureaucracy when it suits him. Anyway.
Yeah, the thing is, like, everything you said, like, if that were to actually happen, it would be amazing. But I think there's a tendency then to the people who are wounded, because they are wounded, we need to accept whatever they want. When I am in a dark place, when I am wounded, there's something wrong with me. It may not even be my fault. I may just be a pure victim. But that does not mean every decision or every solution that I see coming out of my woundedness will actually help me. And
That's right.
so then you have people who want to use my woundedness in order to advance their own agenda. So if I am just totally just destroyed by the sexual abuse crisis, and I mean, what honest Catholic hasn't been on some deep level, and I think that what will fix this is ordained women priests. Okay, that's just what I think. You'll find people in power who will then use my woundedness to advance a thing that will not actually help it at all. And that's
Right.
what I get very worried about in the synod.
I agree that there are people are going to have a variety of theological hobby horses that they're going to ride into that discussion, and a lot of hidden agendas, and they view it as an opportunity to simply take advantage of the wounded church in order to advance agendas that are only going to make the woundedness worse because they're deflections. They're not
It's also incredibly demonic.
Well,
Yeah,
yes.
I mean, yeah.
Yes. Yes, it is demonic. In fact, I mean, Satan is the father of lies, but he's also, for that reason, the father of divisions and of impure motives. And whenever the church succumbs to these kinds of machinations, it's a horrible thing.
And it's interesting because I think in all this too, I think how this all plays out and how one does things is, I think you guys are right about the existential crisis. I think we all feel that every day.
Yes.
And even people who don't, I think a lot of people who are doing various things in the church are acting out of that without realizing that's what they're experiencing. But it is interesting because at the same time, it's like, when it comes they're bringing that question around power again, like you mentioned, coercive power, right? There is times and places where even because the church stands in the world,
Well, it has to have some.
It has to have some, right? When you're a
it has to
pastor,
have some.
sometimes you say this is the way it is in the end because it's what we can do or whatever, right? But people then take that as clericalism when it's actually you're saying no, I'm actually doing this out of service, and I think it's. But at the same time, a good priest or a good bishop will always listen.
Yeah, I mean, it's always got to be reciprocal. I mean, it would be wrong to accuse a parent of parentism if they refuse to let their 14-year-old daughter go on a cruise with a 50-year-old man who she met on the internet. All right, then that's parentism. Nevertheless, a parent should still listen to their child and would want to know, why is it you choose to go on a cruise with a 50-year-old man? What's going on with you, darling, that this is happening in your little life? And so there have to be those open chains of communication. But this is my fear with regard to the synodal process in the church, that it's just simply going to be co-opted and used. And there's... I'll let you. I just want to say one thing, not that it's on my mind. I think this helps go a long way towards explaining to the very recent phenomena, really, of the explosion of the rad trad movement, the radical traditionalist movement. What these are, so many of them are just formerly conservative Catholics, JP2 Catholics, who have in a sense been red-pilled by the past 10 years or so in the church. Sex abuse crisis, the apparent wishy-washiness of Pope Francis, whether that's right or wrong, I'm not going to comment. And so now they've just gone down this rabbit hole of some sort, what I call ecclesial comfort food of the Tridentine liturgy and most people going to hell and Thomas Aquinas. There, fixed it. Vatican II is awful and all that kind of stuff. And so I think that's millions of Catholics are simply walking away. Millions of Catholics are simply sitting in church bored and wondering what's going on here. And then millions of Catholics are going the rad trad route. And somebody has to really put Humpty Dumpty back together. And
we need to realize that even the rad trads are in the peripheries.
Yes, they are.
They're on the same existential peripheries as so many other people. Mm-hmm. And in fact, because here's the secret. Right now, everyone's on a periphery.
That's right. We're all on the peripheries. And this is my big problem with the Pope's motu proprio, Traditionis Custodes. I mean, here's the guy, the Pope of dialogue and accompaniment and all that, and going out to the peripheries and the margins. But when it came to these very deeply wounded and hurting Catholics who are simply looking for, they're out there drowning in our culture, and they're looking for the church to send them a lifeboat, and the church sends them an anchor instead. And, here, catch this anchor. Okay, and no.
You want your tradition, you have Eucharistic Prayer 1, a prayer that's never prayed at most parishes in
That's
America.
right, that's right. There you go.
Every weekend.
No, yeah, of course.
But you said America, though, so...
Yeah, in Canada, they all do Eucharistic Prayer 1, I'm sure, Harrison.
Hey, look,
Sure
I attend an Anglican ordinariate liturgy, and the mass is an hour and a half long, and it's always canon number 1. Always.
That's all they got.
Yeah. Although I say this, that's for Sundays. Weekday masses, they'll use Eucharistic prayer number 2 from the Novus Ordo.
Interesting.
That's what I'll do. The one prayer I almost never pray is 3. It's 2 on the weekdays, and it's 1 on Sundays. Usually.
Yeah, I mean, what's the point to 3? It's too long. It's too long for a weekday and too short for Sunday.
Exactly.
So
It's a minute longer than 2. I've timed it.
So much longer. Oh my goodness, forever.
The long one.
But
is Eucharistic Prayer 4.
Interesting story about Eucharistic prayer number 2. Since we were talking about Louis Bouillet, Louis Bouillet was on the liturgical commission after Vatican II to reform the liturgy, and of course there were all kinds of hijinks that were going on by Bonini and others to sort of force through the Novus Ordo, and Paul VI was not paying much attention. Blah blah. But anyway, Louis Bouillet got word that in 3 hours they were having a meeting, and Eucharistic prayer number 2 had to be submitted at this meeting, and it was the first Bouillet had heard of it. So he actually went with a colleague to a restaurant in a piazza somewhere in Rome and sat down and wrote Eucharistic number 2 in about an hour and a half. Memory says like on a napkin or something, but that's not true. I think he had a notepad or something. But you get the point. I mean, it's no wonder sometimes that the rad trads point at stuff like that and they say, what is going on? And I would say, well, it doesn't mean the Holy Spirit's not involved in Louis Bouillet's pasta amatriciana as he's doing the anaphora of Hippolytus in Eucharistic prayer too. But
and also, people need to realize, like Bouillet, if it wasn't for Bouillet, things may have been worse.
Oh, absolutely.
I think it's
they may have been
interesting the
worse.
little things I hear about with regards to Bouillet. And I remember hearing actually at one point, this is, I don't know how true it is. It may be apocryphal, but the famous story around Bouillet that I've heard is he got so frustrated at one point, he actually handed in his letter of resignation to the Pope. Pope calls him into the office, and Pope says, "Why are you resigning? You are our chief liturgical expert. You are the man." And he says, "Holy Father, everything I recommend to Monsignor Bonini, or everything I recommend, you seem to not do." He goes, "I don't get it. Monsignor Bonini, whatever he brings me, he says that you've wanted it. And then Bouillet's like, "No, you've been doing the opposite." And so if we find out that Bonini's just been playing hard and fast with everyone.
That is not apocryphal. This has now been documented in various books on the history of the liturgical reform. It's been noted. I have several radical traditionalist friends who have pointed this out to me. That now, of course, then it gets tied up in conspiracy theories. Bonini was a Freemason, and so the Novus Ordo is the result of a Freemason plot and Taylor Marshall's infiltration and all of that. And that's a rabbit hole I'm not going to go down. I would just subscribe to the fact that Bonini was a liar and a fraud, and he manipulated the system to get the Novus Ordo through because he wanted it.
Yeah.
Okay, but the reason why, even though those things are bad, evil, and the one thing that we're kind of missing in this, not missing, I would assume we just haven't gotten to it yet, so a thing, and then maybe a deeper question is, how does the Holy Spirit actually work in these super broken systems? One of the reasons why I'm totally okay with praying Eucharistic prayer too, even though I've heard all of those stories, is because I trust that the Holy Spirit has allowed it, and it's fine. And it's not necessarily it's not the canon, but there's nothing wrong with it if you just look at it as it is, right?
It's got all the right stuff there.
It's got all the right stuff. It's fine. Okay.
Yeah.
But like, is there hope for the Holy Spirit to work in the synodal process? And I'll be honest, I'm incredibly cynical. I think that the Holy Spirit will allow a bunch of terrible stuff to happen because it's what we deserve. That's kind of how I see the Holy Spirit working. I don't know if that's good or not. I don't know if that's true or not.
Well, the guidance of the church is a negative charism. All it means is the church isn't going to make some grandiose, gross error in some central matter of the faith. Otherwise, all bets are off. I mean, for example, to go back to the Novus Ordo, yeah, Bugnini did all this stuff, but at the end of the day, it was Pope Paul VI who promulgated the liturgy. It was Pope Paul VI who looked at it and said, okay, fine, let's do it. And so you have to see something there. With regard to the synodal process, I'm skeptical too. I mean, the Holy Spirit, like blood through coronary arteries, can get clogged with clots, and those clots are our sins. And we can block the movement of the Holy Spirit, and the church frequently does. But anyway, Father Harrison, I think you wanted to say something.
Well, I was just going to say, I think, and it kind of ties into a lot of this too, is the way the liturgy got reformed, though, was because of hypercentralization.
Yes.
Which started 500 years ago as a counter-Protestant pushback to unify the church. Because before the 16th century, there were dozens of liturgies of the Roman Rite.
There were.
Right? And they all existed for their own, because I think this has actually been part of the issue around the question, for example, of acculturation. The Roman Rite exists throughout worlds that are neither are just not Roman. Like, sorry, South America is not Roman.
It's true. Africa, Asia,
Africa's not Roma. Yeah, I mean, we're kind of we're English.
Hey, look,
at best, Puritan, whatever. But it's like, and so the process. Everything around, like even all of this, has happened because Rome has insisted we are the only ones who can promulgate liturgy. We are the only, it's still acting out of this kind of central, and it's also very bureaucratic.
This is exactly my point.
Which is also going to be a problem with the synod, because I'm like, man, this thing sounds so bureaucratic. And the problem with bureaucracy when it gets excessive is it says a lot and does nothing.
And it's no slam against the traditional Latin Mass, which is beautiful in its own way. But the fact that for centuries, millennia, the church's official liturgy prayed in a language that the people did not understand, I think speaks to that centralization and that desire. They wanted unity, but in order to have unity, they imposed uniformity. So we're going to have the exact same liturgy, absolutely. These people speak Swahili, we're going to pray in Latin. These people speak Mandarin Chinese, we're going to pray in Latin. Francis Xavier could have probably had a lot more converts that have been allowed not to, do the Mass in Latin. And yet there we had it in Latin. And now the rad trads are running around saying it's a travesty that we have this vernacular liturgy. I think it's a movement of the Holy Spirit well overdue. So in other words, I'm agreeing with you. Mass in the vernacular and the reform of the liturgy was part of this decentralization process. A true act of synodality to spread out, in a sense, liturgical celebration and give it a little more plasticity into how people can tailor the liturgy to their own cultural situations.
It's not even like the pagans that, in a sense, we sinned against in destroying their languages in the liturgy. Even our own Catholics, when the Jesuits found out about the Maronites, they're like, "What is this? We're going to burn all your books, and now this is what you're doing now." Like there is a bad history of that in the West.
Yeah, and there were other rites. I mean, like I said, I attended Anglican ordinariate parish, and so I'm a little bit interested in that history. And if you go back to pre-Reformation English Catholicism, there was a liturgy called the Sarum liturgy, which was a sort of variation on the Roman Latin liturgy, but it was very, very English in its iteration. And it was a gorgeous liturgy, and eventually got translated into English. It fell by the wayside after Henry VIII and so on. But that's an example. And of course, there's always been the Ambrosian liturgy and various Eastern Rite liturgies. So this notion we had to have a uniform liturgy. I also heard arguments, against vernacular, saying, lots of religions have sacred languages. Muslims have Arabic, Jews have Hebrew, Hindus have Sanskrit, and so on. Yeah, look at that though. That's because those were the languages of their scriptures. So if the church is going to have a sacred language, maybe it should be Greek.
Well, we do have the Kyrie, so
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
It's like
Why
I
is it
always-
Latin? Why is it Latin and not Greek then? If you want to talk
because,
about a
again,
sacred
and
language.
it's why I've always liked Ratzinger's thing around why he's always said that we should have some Latin. Like,
Well, sure,
in the sense,
yeah.
in the sense of we are Roman people, that's fine. It also shows you again, like we're the church is always going to be in the mess of history and all this, but it's like, yeah, like maybe some of the things that are normal to the mass each and every week that don't change, that can be a proper place for Latin where you can learn what it means and it expresses. And he calls it kind of the iconostasis of the West, right, where it becomes this mysterious experience,
sure.
which is actually very important to liturgy, but it's like that these historically pure all Latin liturgy is an anomaly rather than the norm.
Yeah, and let's face it, it had become a spectator sport.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't say that with sacrilege in mind. There were a lot
No.
of devout people, but you were a spectator.
But this
And
is
then
the thing. So you have it with online masses with older parishioners who'll say, "Well, I just watch mass at home now. I don't watch it when I'm at the church," because that was what they were raised. It's not a bad, like, it's how they were raised in all this. It is something to observe. It's not something you're immersed in.
Okay, but that's not even true to the people who grew up with Latin Mass. That's true to Gen Xers as well,
Yes, I
who
know.
have no deeper connection to the Mass. So I think it's more prevalent because I think at least the Boomer generation, they still have an inbred understanding that Mass is a thing that happens on Sundays. But at the same time, it's the great tragedy of the Reforms that it remained a spectator sport for so many people.
I think this, in our digital age, this is an increasing problem. Proceeding from the discussions of the Latin Mass, which I may have caricatured improperly, I don't know. My rad trad friends will now rip me. But the fact is, in our you raise a good point. I wrote a blog called "The Bourgeois Church and Spectator Catholicism," in which I pointed out this increasing phenomena of a sense, and it's across the board in everything about our lives. This increasing sense of our detachment from reality. Reality is something we view through a filter now. Reality is something we watch and speculate. There's a great movie from decades ago called "Being There" with Peter Sellers in it. He plays this gardener, Chauncey Gardner, who was very stupid but was thought to be profound. And his favorite phrase was, "I like to watch." And because he liked to watch TV, and he simply emulated everything he saw on TV. And we have Marshall McLuhan, of course, Catholic, became famous for the medium is the message. And our medium is the digitized thing that we're actually talking through right now. And it is changing our consciousness. It's not just our attention spans. It's changing the very substance of how we view reality. And so now when we attend Mass, I see, and I'm not preaching at others, I see this in myself. I attend Mass and I find myself instinctively detached, looking at it as if, this is something I'm watching on my iPad or something,
Yeah.
and I have to catch myself and say, "Hey, idiot, pray. You're here to pray, fool."
Right.
So anyway.
I have one little comment, and then I got a question about that, because I think I've been saying this to some friends lately. We desperately need to theologically engage with the notion of the digital age, the internet, right? All this stuff,
yes.
because I get so frustrated when people say the internet's not real life. I'm like, actually, it is, because it's part of reality. And therefore, like, there's a metaphysics to the internet that we have not engaged with sufficiently, and theologically
Absolutely
to ask these questions about what can be communicated over this, because something is communicated, but how is it different than, like, we need to be engaging with this theologically, and we're not, and until we do, we're going to treat it as if it, like, because you hear it all the time, like, a lot of bishops, unfortunately, I think, don't see the reality of this, and it's why the blog sphere can become such the Taylor Marshalls and stuff become so influential, is because we actually don't take it seriously. We don't realize this is the place people go to day in and day out, because we haven't taken it theologically seriously.
We haven't taken I like what you said, the metaphysics of the internet seriously, as to how it's radically altered the very substance of our consciousness and how we view reality. For example, how deep a sea change in people's awareness of their reality was there when we went from sundials to clocks. Now our lives became slaves to the clock. slaves to this minute. I had a professor that once made fun of this. So what time should I meet with you? At 12:03. All right, and that was his way of spoofing the fact that we are slaves to this thing called the clock now, and our whole economy gets routed around this thing called the clock. And now we've moved from an analog universe to a digital one, and I think the verdict is still out as to what is that doing to our consciousness. I mean, I grew up in an era of rotary telephones, and a portable phone was one with a long cord. 3 stations on the TV, no cell phones or anything. And so, I'm 63 years old, and I've lived through these changes, and yet I now am equally influenced by this as a 10-year-old. And so I'm wondering, at least I grew up in the pre-digital age. What is happening with young people today that this is the only reality that they have ever known?
Mm-hmm. Oh, I can tell you a little bit, at least some of the effects of it. Just a few weeks ago, I was helping out on this big retreat I mentioned on the podcast, big youth retreat. It's been going on for 20 years for high schoolers. And the one thing that we noticed on that, but also youth ministers I worked with, is that literally kids do not know how to hang out anymore. Now, I'm painting with broad strokes. There are people who do have close friends, and sure. But like literally not knowing what to do. Part of the ministry at my last parish that I was working on with my youth minister, and God bless him, he was doing most of the work, was like, oh, we've got to teach these kids, before we get to Jesus, how to talk to each other. Because it really is that bad in so many ways. It's not that they have interactions at school and stuff, but it has had a deep effect. Like for 2 days, when we've told you not to use your phones, and God bless them, they really didn't. One of the major complaints was like, we don't know what to do. And so one of the most formative experiences was when someone grabbed a Frisbee and we all just started getting in a big circle and throwing the Frisbee around. Like that was one of the more formative experiences. Maybe right below adoration, 2 hours of adoration was the Frisbee throwing, right? Because this really does, and we don't appreciate it.
And I just noticed it even myself often now. Like, and I'm someone who has very few apps on my phone, but the amount I text with people, I realize it's so much easier for me to have text. I find it much easier to have a text, and I like to talk. I find it easier to have a text conversation with people sometimes than it is to have an in real life conversation, because the phone has changed how I interact with that, and that disturbs me. And that it does actually, because I'm of the age where I'm on that verge where I remember life without a computer, and I remember life with a computer. I mean, now I've lived life more with than without, but in all of that, you start to realize, like, so it makes you conscious of this, where for them, they don't know anything else. So they don't know this, that this is, and the dangerous thing becomes as like I get older and stuff, where people haven't experienced this and it gets lost in the cultural memory. People won't know how to judge that.
But they do know something's wrong. That's one fascinating
thing. They do. I mean, like in all technologies, there's a benefit to it, and then there's a huge downside. I mean, like with regard to text messaging, I mean, it's great. Like I'm at the grocery store, and a simple thing from my wife, instead of a phone call, hey, don't forget the rat poison and your hemorrhoid medicine. Okay, great. And
don't mix them up either. You have healthy rats and a very sick Larry.
Yeah, exactly. That's fictional, by the way. But so it's good for that. All right. But what I object to, then, I hate having long conversations with people via text message, and I will say to them eventually, after like 30 things, I said, could call me, and then okay, I'll see you later. Bye. And you know what worries me is that I don't mind the drive-by text here and there to just inform, like we were doing earlier, setting up this show. But when it is a substitute for real conversation, what it says to me is, I really kind of want to chat with you, but I don't really want to chat with you so much that I really want to talk to you.
Or my generation, I don't want to be a burden to you, because I know you're probably busy or whatever.
It's both.
I just want to get this. I want to get this out there, and if it becomes something substantial, then maybe we can have a real life conversation.
That's interesting. So I never thought of it that way.
No, that's part of it. There is this feeling in millennial generation. I think it's that you are a constant burden. It's why we say, instead of saying I'm sorry, we say my bad, because I am taking on. Since I already know I'm a burden, and I don't want you to feel what I always feel as a burden, I'll take on more of that. it's my bad. So you
Yeah,
don't have
that's
to feel
interesting.
bad. So it's part of
Yeah.
that. But also, I do think underlying the I don't want to be a burden, I also, because life is so existentially burdensome to me, I don't want to deal with you
As a
because
yeah.
as a burden, because other people are burdens. And if you're not used to carrying them, a 5-minute conversation where you have to deal with this other person, that's a burden. It's
Yeah,
it's
friendship is hard to
it
sustain.
is. It's
I know
work.
we all know people in life who don't have a whole lot of friends, or have friends for a while and they fall away. Friends for the, and it's not because they had a falling out. It's just that they failed to keep up with each other because it's work. And the fact is, as Christians, we need to understand. Of course, I'm a burden to you. Some more than other. Like I'm a real burden to my wife. All right, and of course I'm a burden to you, and you're a burden to me. But it's a burden of love,
Yes.
because the reason why it's a burden is because I love you. If I didn't love you, then I wouldn't care when you slight me or whatever. I would just get fungu and off with you, and get your car out of my way, and that sort of thing. It's only deeply burdensome when you care about somebody. And so I do wonder when it's somebody that I actually am close to, a family member, a deep friend, and it's text. Hey, call me. Well, I got stuff to do. I'll see you later. Yeah. And it's like, well, a part of it is just the habit of what we've gotten used to now. With I don't want to be, but that's the part. That's the whole point. It's the pattern of what we've gotten used to, and what has it done to us?
And we haven't asked those questions, right?
Right.
And it's one of Ratzinger's big points when he's reflecting on moral theology, that we allow technology to advance faster than our moral reflection. And I think we need to ask questions around, like, how does this affect, like you said, consciousness, how I perceive the world? How does this affect my body? Because it does, right? Like, how does it affect me psychologically? How does it affect relationship? All those things. Because there have been benefits. This conversation would not be happening without without the internet right now. Our podcast would not be happening without the internet right now, right? So this is all good stuff. So it's not all bad either. And so we just need to
Oh yeah, I mean, I live
theologically about this.
I live 1,300 miles away from my home state of Nebraska, where all of my family still lives. And, things like FaceTime and all that, that's a blessing. That's an absolute blessing.
Yeah. So, okay, it's wrap up time, but just quickly, bring back into the synodality stuff quickly.
Sure.
Do you have a quick list, Larry, of what you think would need to happen for synodality to work well?
To get the blood clots out.
Yeah, we have to become a church of the poor. Okay. That's what, and by poor, I mean a church of the peripheries, a church of the marginalized, a church for even wealthy people that are hurting. That's what I mean by a church of the poor. It's got to be, it sounds cliche, perhaps, a bit vague, a bit abstract, but this is my Catholic worker, Dorothy Day, localist sort of coming out in me, that a church that isn't holy isn't much of a church. And we hide behind the skirts of ex opere operato and the bureaucracy and sinless yet sinful. And the bottom line is the church lacks complete credibility when it is a church of no transparency, hiding predators, bureaucracy, top-down management. So a true synodality, I don't care what form it takes. Episcopal conferences, local synods on the diocesan level, I don't care what form it takes. Because none of it will matter without the true reform of holiness that has to take place in the church. And so, in other words, I think true synod is going to require a kind of what Dorothy Day called a revolution of the heart. We need a new revivalism. We need a new outflowing of the Spirit in the church. And we need to pray for that and do sacrifices for that.
And all of our dioceses need to go bankrupt, and we need to fire all of our lawyers to make that happen.
Not a bad idea. And so just along these same lines, the Vatican Bank has scandal after scandal after scandal. I have a solution. Get rid of the Vatican Bank. Why does the Vatican need its own bank?
You hear that, Ed? That's what we need to work on, Ed Condon.
Because it's sovereign territory.
Then get rid of it.
Pillar.
You can't reform the Vatican Bank. You can't stop the money laundering, the child sex trafficking money that gets shot through the Vatican Bank. Fine. Close it down. Shut the cesspool down. Why can't we do that?
Because
the church has to be independent. Vatican City State's got to have its own bank and its own post office and its own pantaloon guards.
I think the worry becomes then the Pope is now susceptible to foreign pressure if he's not diplomatically independent.
He's only susceptible in as much as he's willing to be martyred.
And make no mistake about exactly. I agree with that completely.
That's
And the
fair.
Italian state tomorrow could revoke the Lateran Treaty in 3 seconds with a stroke of a pen and goose step their way into Vatican City and take it all down.
All while smoking cigarettes and eating prosciutto.
Guess what is that? Guess what is it? Yeah, absolutely. Or what might happen, for example, with regard to certain scandals and how the Vatican judicial system works, is the EU might up and decide to heck with the Vatican's judicial system. You have violated the final court of appeal is the Pope, and what if the Pope is the problem? All right, there's no appellate system, there's no checks and balances.
Problem is, though, but here's the thing, though. In nation states, though, the prime minister or whatever is also like not touchable. Like there are certain places and times where these people, because of their position, they're untouchable. They're literally untouchable because of their position and because of their office. And so, I mean, because this actually starts, I mean, we will not go here right now, but this starts to open up a whole other can of worms around accountability, and also I think about the encroachment of modernity on the church, that we exist. For the church to work in the world, she needs to be able to function within civil structures, because she has both feet in the kingdom of God and in the city
That's
of man,
all true.
right? But the problem becomes, of course, what I've been reflecting on lately is that the city of man is just creating so many things that it's suffocating the church's ability to breathe. And
Yes.
we are not adapting to how we can stand in the city of man differently. And that is a whole other thing. So we'll have to have you back on.
So
for something like
exactly. Okay, so this conversation has been so much fun.
Yeah.
So good.
I enjoyed that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think,
Went
Larry,
totally
we're
places
gonna
I did not expect, which is great.
Larry, we're gonna have to have you back on, but we'll give you the last word. Plug anything you want to plug. Say anything you want to say. Go for it.
I would just encourage everybody to read my blog, gaudium22.com, and that's my final word.
And we also encourage that. All right. Hey, everybody, thanks for listening. Please remember to like, subscribe, all that fun stuff. It makes more people listen to our podcast, and that's good. At least we think it is, or else we wouldn't be doing it. Please leave a review on iTunes. Tell your friends about the podcast. Tell your enemies too, because Jesus says we must love our enemies. You can find me doing 5,000 funerals at my parish.
You can find me keeping my head above water somehow.
Contact the podcast. We've totally skipped the whole Twitter thing. Contact the podcast and receive updates at ClericalPod on Twitter. Find us on Facebook, YouTube, or email us at clericallyspeaking@gmail.com. Check out our Patreon. Donate if you want to support the lay people who make this happen. Producer Nick and producer Riley and their little baby producer Indiana. God bless.
God bless.
Oh, that's your line. Sorry. Peace.